Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be invisible in your own family? To sit in a room full of people who share your DNA yet feel like you're watching your life through a window, always on the outside looking in? Some of us carry secrets we never speak about, wounds that formed so early we mistake them for parts of ourselves. This is the story of a woman named Rebecca, and how one moment of public humiliation became the catalyst for uncovering a family truth that would change everything she thought she knew about love, perfection, and the price we pay for being the lesser child. Rebecca Martinez was 27 years old when her world crumbled at her sister's law school graduation ceremony in Phoenix, Arizona. It was May of 2019, and the desert heat was already beginning to settle over the city like a heavy blanket, but nothing could have prepared her for the suffocating weight of shame that would descend upon her that afternoon. She had driven 3 hours from Tucson, where she worked as a social worker at a community nonprofit, to watch her older sister Sophia receive her Juris Doctor from Arizona State University. Sophia was 29, just 2 years older than Rebecca, but in their family dynamics, those 2 years might as well have been 2 decades. As Rebecca sat in the crowded auditorium, surrounded by proud families clutching flowers and cameras, she couldn't help but reflect on how different this day might have been if their parents had ever looked at her the way they looked at Sophia. The Martinez family had always operated under an unspoken hierarchy, one that placed Sophia at the apex of achievement and relegated Rebecca to a supporting role in the story of their family's success. Their parents, Maria and Carlos Martinez, had immigrated from Mexico in the early 80s, carrying dreams of a better life and the fierce determination that only comes from leaving everything behind for the promise of opportunity. Those dreams had crystallized around Sophia from the moment she could walk and talk. She was the child who never colored outside the lines, who read chapter books while her kindergarten classmates were still struggling with picture books, who won spelling bees and science fairs and earned perfect attendance awards year after year. Sophia was the golden child who spoke English without an accent, who could navigate the complexities of American culture while still honoring their Mexican heritage, who seemed destined for greatness from the very beginning. And Rebecca, well, Rebecca was the afterthought, the second child who came along when their parents were already convinced they had achieved perfection with their first attempt. Growing up in the Martinez household meant living in Sophia's shadow, watching their parents pour their hopes and resources into the child who seemed most likely to fulfill their American dream. Rebecca learned early that love in their family was conditional, measured by achievement, and distributed according to potential. When Sophia brought home straight A's, there were celebrations and special dinners and calls to relatives in Mexico to share the good news. When Rebecca brought home A's and B's, there were polite nods and gentle reminders about how much better she could do if she just tried harder, like her sister. The pattern established itself so early that Rebecca barely remembered a time when it wasn't normal. Sophia got the brand name clothes for school, Rebecca got hand-me-downs and discount store alternatives. Sophia got piano lessons and tutoring and every opportunity their parents could afford. Rebecca got whatever was left over after Sophia's needs were met. When parent-teacher conferences rolled around, both parents attended Sophia's meetings with enthusiasm and anticipation. For Rebecca's conferences, usually just their mother went, and only if it didn't conflict with something more important in Sophia's schedule. It wasn't that their parents were cruel or deliberately neglectful. They genuinely believed they were being practical, investing their limited resources in the child who showed the most promise. In their minds, Sophia was going to be the one who would lift the entire family out of their working-class circumstances, who would become the lawyer or doctor or professional who could provide for them in their old age and prove that their sacrifice in leaving Mexico had been worth it. Rebecca, with her more average grades and her tendency toward emotional sensitivity, was seen as sweet but unremarkable. Someone who would probably marry young and have children and live a nice, ordinary life that wouldn't contribute much to the family's upward mobility. By the time Rebecca reached high school, the dynamic was so entrenched that she had stopped expecting equal treatment. When Sophia graduated as valedictorian and received a full scholarship to Arizona State University, the celebration lasted for weeks. Entire extended family was invited to a massive party in their backyard, where relatives flew in from California and Texas, and even some cousins made the trip from Guadalajara to honor Sophia's achievement. Pictures from that party still hung on the walls of their parents' house. Evidence of the pride and joy that comes with watching your dreams materialize in your child's success. 2 years later, when Rebecca graduated in the top 20% of her class with plans to attend University of Arizona on a partial scholarship, the celebration was markedly more subdued. Their parents took her to dinner at a nice restaurant and told her they were proud, but there was no party, No relatives flying in, no photographs that would earn a place of honor on the wall. The message was clear even if it was never explicitly stated. This was nice, but it wasn't the kind of achievement that changed a family's trajectory. Rebecca had spent her college years trying to find her own identity, separate from the role of Sophia's younger sister that had defined her for so long. She majored in social work, drawn to the idea of helping families navigate systems and find resources, perhaps unconsciously processing her own experience of feeling lost within her own family system. She developed close friendships, joined clubs, and even had serious relationships with young men who knew nothing about her family dynamics and saw her simply as Rebecca, not as the disappointing follow-up to someone more impressive. But every visit home reminded her of her place in the family hierarchy. Their parents' refrigerator was covered with Sophia's academic achievements, internship announcements, and eventually her law school acceptance letter. Rebecca's college milestones were acknowledged but never displayed with the same prominence. When she made Dean's List, her parents expressed pride but quickly shifted the conversation to Sophia's latest accomplishment. When she was accepted to graduate school for her master's in social work, their parents seemed pleased but not surprised, as if they expected her to continue achieving at a level that was respectable but not exceptional. The most painful part wasn't even the differential treatment, though that certainly stung. It was the casual way their parents discussed their daughter's futures in front of them, as if Rebecca wasn't sitting right there listening. At family dinners, they would talk about how Sophia was going to be a successful attorney, maybe even a judge someday. And wouldn't it be wonderful when she could afford to buy them a nice house and take them on vacations? Then they would turn to Rebecca with gentle smiles and express hope that she would find a nice husband who could provide for her and maybe give them grandchildren to spoil. The assumption that Rebecca's value lay primarily in her potential as a wife and mother, while Sophia's worth was measured by her professional achievements, created a fundamental inequality that affected every aspect of their relationship as sisters. Sophia, to her credit, never seemed to notice or deliberately exploit this favoritism. She loved Rebecca genuinely and was always kind and supportive, but she also lived her entire life receiving the kind of unconditional parental pride that Rebecca had never experienced. This created a dynamic where Sophia couldn't fully understand Rebecca's pain because she had never experienced anything like it herself. When Sophia started law school in 2016, their parents' excitement reached new heights. They attended every orientation event they were allowed to attend, proudly telling anyone who would listen that their daughter was going to be a lawyer. They helped her move into her apartment near campus, bought her a new laptop and all the textbooks she needed, and called her every few days to check on her progress and offer encouragement. When she struggled with the intensity of her first-year courses, they reassured her that she was brilliant and capable and destined for success. Meanwhile, Rebecca was working at the nonprofit in Tucson, helping low-income families access resources and navigate bureaucratic systems that often seemed designed to exclude them. Her work was meaningful and important, but it wasn't the kind of career that generated the same level of family pride as law school. When she called home to share stories about the families she was helping or the small victories she was achieving in her work, her parents listened politely, but without the enthusiasm they reserved for Sophia's law school updates. The emotional distance created by years of being the less favored child had taught Rebecca to manage her expectations and protect her feelings by not investing too heavily in her parents' approval. She had built a life in Tucson that felt authentic and fulfilling, surrounded by colleagues who valued her work and friends who appreciated her for who she was, rather than comparing her to anyone else. But family events still had the power to transport her back to childhood feelings of inadequacy and invisibility, no matter how much personal growth she had achieved in her independent adult life. As law school graduation approached in the spring of 2019, the Martinez family's excitement reached fever pitch. This wasn't just any graduation, this was the culmination of their American dream, the moment when all their sacrifice and investment would be validated by their daughter's entry into one of the most prestigious professions in the country. They had invited extended family members from across the Southwest to witness this historic moment. Hotel reservations were made, restaurants were booked for celebration dinners, and their parents spent weeks preparing for what they clearly viewed as the most important day in their family's history. Rebecca knew her role in this celebration was to be supportive and proud of her sister, and she genuinely was. Despite the years of feeling overlooked and undervalued, she loved Sophia and wanted her to succeed. But she also couldn't ignore the stark contrast between this massive celebration and the quiet acknowledgement her own achievements had received. When she had graduated with her master's degree the year before, their parents had attended the ceremony and taken her to dinner afterward. But there had been no extended family gathering, No weeks of preparation, no sense that this was a milestone worthy of major celebration. The graduation ceremony itself was beautiful, held at Arizona State University's Wells Fargo Arena in Phoenix on a brilliant May afternoon. Rebecca sat with her parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends, all gathered to watch Sophia receive her diploma. When Sophia's name was called and she walked across the stage in her cap and gown, the entire section erupted in cheers and applause. Rebecca felt genuine pride watching her sister achieve this milestone, but she also felt the familiar pang of knowing that she would never generate this level of family excitement, no matter what she accomplished in her own life. After the ceremony, they all gathered at an upscale restaurant in Scottsdale for a celebration dinner. The private dining room was decorated with congratulatory banners, and their parents had prepared speeches to honor Sophia's achievement. Rebecca expected the usual expressions of pride and predictions about Sophia's bright future, and she had mentally prepared herself to smile and clap and play her supporting role in the family narrative. But what happened next would haunt her for years to come and ultimately change the trajectory of her relationship with her family forever. As their father, Carlos, stood to make his speech, wine glass raised and smile beaming, he began by talking about how proud he and Maria were of their daughter, Sophia, how she had exceeded every expectation and dream they had ever dared to have. The words were beautiful and heartfelt, and Rebecca felt genuinely happy for her sister as she listened. Then their father's tone shifted slightly, taking on the casual humor that families often employ when they want to say something cutting while maintaining the illusion of playfulness. He began talking about how smart they had been to focus their resources and attention on Sophia, because not all children are destined for greatness, and parents have to be strategic about where they invest their hopes and dreams. The room laughed as he joked about how they had learned their lesson about having too many children, because second children are usually just pale imitations of the first. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn as the implications of his words sank in. He wasn't just praising Sophia, he was explicitly dismissing Rebecca's worth and suggesting that her very existence had been a mistake. But he wasn't finished. He went on to joke that if they had stopped after having Sophia, they could have devoted all their time, attention, and resources to their perfect daughter, instead of spreading themselves thin trying to raise two children when only one had real potential. The casual cruelty of the words, delivered with smiles and laughter in front of their entire extended family, hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She looked around the room, hoping to see some recognition on other faces that this had crossed a line, that no parent should speak about one child this way in front of a room full of people. But all she saw were smiling faces, people nodding in agreement or laughing along with what they apparently viewed as harmless family humor. Her mother, Maria, continued the speech, talking about how they had always known that Sophia was special, that she was the child who would fulfill all their dreams and justify all their sacrifices. He spoke about the car they had just purchased for Sophia as a graduation gift, a brand new Honda Accord that would help her navigate her new professional life. The room erupted in applause and congratulations as Sophia hugged her parents, tears of joy streaming down her face. Rebecca sat frozen in her chair, trying to process what had just happened. Years of subtle favoritism and differential treatment had just been made explicit in public. Her parents had essentially announced to their entire extended family that she was an unwanted accident, a drain on resources that could have been better spent on their worthier daughter. The humiliation was complete and devastating, made worse by the fact that no one else seemed to recognize it as inappropriate or cruel. As the evening continued with toasts and congratulations and celebration, Rebecca felt herself retreating emotionally, going through the motions of participation while internally processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. This wasn't just thoughtless parental favoritism anymore. This was a deliberate and public rejection of her value as a human being and a member of their family. The message couldn't have been clearer if they had written it in neon letters. Sophia matters and Rebecca doesn't. When the celebration finally ended and the extended family began heading back to their hotels, Rebecca knew she had to confront her parents about what had happened. She couldn't let this moment pass without addressing how deeply their words had hurt her and how inappropriate their behavior had been. She had spent 27 years accepting differential treatment and managing her expectations. But this public humiliation was a bridge too far. She approached her parents as they were gathering their things to leave the restaurant, their faces still glowing with pride and satisfaction from the evening celebration. When she quietly asked if they could talk privately about something important, they seemed surprised and slightly annoyed, as if she was imposing on their perfect evening with unnecessary drama. When Rebecca tried to explain how hurtful their speech had been and how devastating it felt to be dismissed so casually in front of their entire family, her parents' response was swift and dismissive. They told her she was being overly sensitive and taking harmless jokes too seriously. Her father insisted that everything he had said was true and that she shouldn't blame them for being disappointed in her lack of achievement compared to her sister. The conversation that followed was perhaps even more painful than the original humiliation. Instead of acknowledging her feelings or offering any kind of apology, her parents doubled down on their position. Her mother told her she was being selfish for trying to make Sophia's special day about herself. Her father went further, telling her bluntly that he had nothing to be proud of when it came to her accomplishments and that she had no right to be upset about them being disappointed in who she had become. The casualness with which they delivered these devastating words was almost worse than the words themselves. They spoke as if Rebecca's feelings didn't matter, as if her pain was an unreasonable imposition on their right to celebrate their successful daughter without having to consider the feelings of their unsuccessful one. The conversation ended with them telling her to stop being so dramatic and to focus on being happy for her sister instead of wallowing in self-pity. When Sophia learned about the confrontation, her response was equally hurtful in a different way. She defended their parents, insisting that their speech had been harmless and that Rebecca was overreacting to what had simply been lighthearted family humor. She suggested that if Rebecca had worked harder and achieved more, like Sophia had, then maybe their parents would have had more to celebrate about her as well. The implication that Rebecca's pain was self-inflicted, that she had somehow earned this treatment through her own inadequacy, was devastating. Meant that even her sister, the one person in the family who should have understood the dynamic they had grown up with, either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge the fundamental mental unfairness of how they had been treated differently their entire lives. In the days following the graduation celebration, Rebecca found herself replaying the events over and over, trying to understand how her own family could have treated her with such casual cruelty. She began to see her entire childhood and adolescence in a new light, recognizing patterns of favoritism and emotional neglect that she had previously accepted as normal family dynamics. The realization that her parents genuinely viewed her as a disappointment and mistake was crushing, but it was also clarifying in some ways. For the first time in her life, Rebecca began to seriously consider the possibility that the problem wasn't with her worthiness or achievements, but with her family's capacity to love unconditionally. She started to understand that no amount of achievement or good behavior would ever earn her the kind of love and pride they showered on Sophia, because their affection was fundamentally conditional and she had been predetermined as the less worthy recipient. This recognition led to a painful but necessary decision. Rebecca realized that continuing to subject herself to this dynamic was not only harmful to her self-esteem, but also prevented her from building the kind of life and relationships she deserved. She needed distance from her family to heal from years of emotional damage and to discover who she could become when she wasn't constantly trying to prove her worth to people who had already decided she wasn't worthy. In the months following Sophia's graduation, Rebecca gradually reduced contact with her family. She stopped calling as frequently, declined invitations to family gatherings, and began focusing her energy on building stronger relationships with friends and colleagues who valued her for who she was. It was a difficult and lonely process, but it was also liberating to step away from the constant emotional bruising that came with trying to earn love from people who had already allocated it elsewhere. 3 years passed in this state of minimal contact. Rebecca threw herself into her work, eventually taking a position with a larger nonprofit organization that allowed her to expand her impact and develop new programs for at-risk families. She built friendships that felt reciprocal and nurturing, started dating someone who appreciated her kindness and intelligence without comparing her to anyone else, and began the slow process of healing from a lifetime of feeling inadequate and unwanted. She heard updates about Sophia through mutual family friends and social media, learning that her sister had gotten a job at a prestigious law firm in Phoenix and was building what appeared to be a very successful career. Rebecca felt genuinely happy for Sophia's success, but she no longer felt the familiar pang of comparison and inadequacy that had once accompanied news of her sister's achievements. The distance had allowed her to develop her own sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on family approval or measured against someone else's accomplishments. Then, in the fall of 2022, Rebecca received a phone call that would change everything she thought she understood about her family's dynamics and the price of being the golden child. It was a Tuesday evening in October when her phone rang with a call from her mother. The first time they had spoken in several months, Maria's voice was shaky and uncertain in a way Rebecca had never heard before, and she knew immediately that something was seriously wrong. The news her mother delivered was shocking and heartbreaking. Sophia, the perfect daughter who had always seemed to have everything under control, had been discovered by her law firm colleagues in a state that revealed she was struggling with a severe addiction to prescription opioids. She had apparently started using pain medication following a minor surgery the previous year, and what began as legitimate medical treatment had spiraled into dependency and eventually addiction. The revelation was stunning on multiple levels. First, it meant that Sophia, the child who had always appeared to have everything together, had been struggling with serious problems that no one in the family had recognized or suspected. Second, it suggested that the pressure of being the perfect child, the one carrying all the family's hopes and dreams, had created its own form of psychological burden that had contributed to this devastating outcome. As Rebecca listened to her mother's tearful explanation of what had happened, she began to understand that Sophia's perfectionism and high achievement had come at a significant personal cost. The constant pressure to excel, to justify the family's investment in her, to carry the weight of everyone's expectations, had apparently created a level of stress and anxiety that became unbearable. The prescription drugs had initially provided relief from that pressure, but quickly became a new source of shame and fear as the addiction took hold. What was most heartbreaking was learning that Sophia had been struggling alone, unable to admit to anyone in the family that she was having problems because she felt responsible for maintaining her image as the successful daughter who never needed help. The very pedestal that the family had placed her on had become a prison that prevented her from seeking support when she desperately needed it. Her parents were calling Rebecca because they were overwhelmed and didn't know how to handle the situation. Their perfect daughter, the one who was supposed to take care of them in their old age, needed intensive treatment and support. But they were also paralyzed by shame and fear about what this revelation would mean for their family's reputation and their own sense of identity as successful parents. The conversation revealed the depth of her parents' inability to cope with imperfection or vulnerability in any form. Instead of focusing on getting Sophia the professional help she needed, they were primarily concerned with keeping her addiction secret and finding a way to fix the problem without anyone outside the family finding out. They begged Rebecca to come home and help them manage the situation, to use her background in social work to somehow solve this crisis without involving medical professionals or treatment facilities. Rebecca found herself in an impossible position. Part of her wanted to help Sophia, who was clearly in crisis and needed support. But another part of her recognized that her parents were once again asking her to sacrifice her own well-being to clean up a family problem. And they were still more concerned with appearances than with getting Sophia the appropriate care she needed. The conversation also revealed how little her parents understood about addiction or mental health, despite Rebecca's professional experience in these areas. They seemed to believe that addiction was a moral failing rather than a medical condition, and they were convinced that with enough family support and determination, Sophia could simply choose to stop using drugs without professional intervention. When Rebecca suggested that Sophia needed to enter a residential treatment program to address both the physical addiction and the underlying psychological issues that had contributed to her substance use, her parents reacted with horror. The idea of their perfect daughter being in a treatment facility where other people might learn about her problems was unthinkable to them. They preferred the fantasy that they could handle this crisis privately, maintaining the fiction that their family was still the success story they had always believed it to be. The phone call ended with Rebecca promising to think about their request and call them back, but she knew she was facing one of the most difficult decisions of her adult life. She could return to a family system that had never valued her appropriately and try to help them manage a crisis they were fundamentally unprepared to handle properly. Or she could maintain the boundaries she had worked so hard to establish and insist that they get Sophia professional help, rather than trying to solve this problem with family intervention alone. Over the next few days, Rebecca struggled with feelings of guilt, compassion, anger, and confusion as she tried to decide how to respond to this crisis. She felt genuine concern for Sophia and wanted her sister to get the help she needed to recover from her addiction. But she also recognized that her parents were asking her to step back into a family dynamic that had been psychologically harmful to her, and they were still prioritizing image management over appropriate care for their daughter. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. After years of being treated as the inadequate daughter, she was now being called upon to solve a crisis that the perfect daughter and her devoted parents couldn't handle alone. But instead of feeling vindicated or superior, Rebecca felt profound sadness for everyone involved, including Sophia. who had apparently been suffering under the weight of expectations that were ultimately impossible to sustain. She decided to call Sophia directly, reasoning that she needed to hear from her sister what kind of support she actually wanted and needed, rather than allowing their parents to control the narrative about what was happening. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest and painful discussions Rebecca had ever had with her sister. And it fundamentally changed her understanding of their family dynamics and the different ways they had both been damaged by their parents' approach to love and approval. When Sophia answered the phone, her voice was different from anything Rebecca had ever heard before. Gone was the confident, composed tone of the successful law student and attorney. Instead, Sophia sounded fragile, frightened, and exhausted in ways that immediately conveyed the depth of her struggle. She had always been the sister who had everything under control, who never needed help or support from anyone else. Hearing her sound so vulnerable and broken was deeply disturbing and also somehow revelatory. As they talked, Sophia began to share details about her experience that helped Rebecca understand how the addiction had developed and why she had been unable to ask for help earlier. The pressure of law school had been intense, but the pressure of early career success had been even worse. She was working 60 to 80 hours per week at a law firm where anything less than perfection was seen as failure, and she was constantly terrified of making mistakes that would confirm her fears that she didn't really deserve her position. The pain medication had initially been prescribed following surgery to repair a herniated disc, an injury she had sustained from long hours hunched over law books and computer screens. But she quickly discovered that the medication didn't just relieve physical pain, it also provided temporary relief from the anxiety and self-doubt that had been her constant companion since starting her legal career. What followed was a classic pattern of prescription drug addiction. As her tolerance increased, she needed higher doses to achieve the same effects. When her prescription ran out, she found ways to obtain additional medication through doctor shopping and eventually through illegal sources. The shame and secrecy required to maintain her addiction created additional stress that made the medication even more necessary as a coping mechanism. The most devastating part of Sophia's story was her description of the isolation she felt while struggling with addiction. She couldn't admit to their parents that she was having problems because she knew it would shatter their image of her as the perfect daughter who justified all their sacrifices. She couldn't admit to colleagues that she was struggling because her career depended on maintaining an image of competence and reliability. And she couldn't admit to friends that she needed help because she had never learned how to be vulnerable or imperfect in relationships. As Rebecca listened to her sister describe years of suffering in silence, she began to understand that Sophia had been as damaged by their family's dynamics as she had been, just in different ways. While Rebecca had grown up feeling inadequate and unworthy, Sophia had grown up feeling responsible for carrying everyone's dreams and terrified of disappointing anyone. The pressure of being the golden child had created its own form of psychological prison, one that prevented Sophia from developing healthy coping mechanisms or authentic relationships. The conversation also revealed that Sophia had always been aware of the differential treatment they had received from their parents, and she had felt guilty about it even as she benefited from it. She had wanted to speak up during childhood when their parents were being unfair to Rebecca, but she had also been afraid of losing her special status and becoming the target of disappointment herself. This awareness had created additional guilt and anxiety that she had carried into adulthood. Perhaps most importantly, Sophia acknowledged that their parents' speech at her graduation had been cruel and inappropriate, and she apologized for defending their behavior at the time. She admitted that she had been so dependent on their approval that she couldn't risk challenging them, even when she knew they were wrong. This acknowledgement was healing for Rebecca, who had begun to doubt her own perception of that painful evening. As their conversation continued, both sisters began to recognize how their family's approach to love and approval had set them up for different but equally damaging psychological challenges. Rebecca had learned to expect rejection and had developed resilience in the face of disappointment, but she had also struggled with self-worth and the ability to believe she deserved unconditional love. Sophia had learned to expect approval only in exchange for perfect performance, and she had never developed the ability to cope with failure or to seek help when she was struggling. By the end of their conversation, both sisters were crying, grieving not just for Sophia's current crisis, but for the childhood experiences that had created the conditions for this tragedy. They also began talking about what genuine healing would require, both for Sophia's addiction and for the family patterns that had contributed to it. Sophia acknowledged that she needed professional treatment, not just family support, to address her addiction properly. She also recognized that she needed therapy to understand how the pressure of being the perfect daughter had contributed to her substance use and to learn healthier ways of coping with stress and disappointment. Most importantly, she expressed a desire to build a more honest and equal relationship with Rebecca, one that wasn't based on the roles they had been assigned in childhood. Becca, for her part, expressed her willingness to support Sophia's recovery process, but she also made it clear that she wouldn't return to family dynamics that were harmful to her own mental health. She offered to help research treatment options and to be available for emotional support, but she wouldn't enable their parents' denial about the seriousness of Sophia's condition or their resistance to professional intervention. The sisters agreed to work together to convince their parents that Sophia needed residential treatment, recognizing that this would require them to confront their family's shame about mental health issues and addiction. They also talked about the possibility of family therapy to address the dysfunctional patterns that had contributed to both of their struggles. Though they acknowledged that their parents might not be willing to participate in that level of honest self-examination. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca found herself navigating a complex process of re-engaging with her family while maintaining the boundaries she had worked hard to establish. She researched treatment facilities and helped Sophia understand her options for recovery. She also had difficult conversations with her parents about the reality of addiction and the necessity of professional treatment. Her parents' resistance to acknowledging the seriousness of Sophia's condition was frustrating but not surprising. They continued to believe that family love and determination could solve any problem, and they were deeply ashamed about what Sophia's addiction might say about their parenting or their family's status in their community. It took weeks of patient education and gentle confrontation before they accepted that residential treatment was necessary. The process of getting Sophia into treatment also revealed additional layers of family dysfunction that Rebecca had never fully recognized. Their parents' inability to cope with imperfection or vulnerability extended beyond their treatment of their daughters. It affected every aspect of how they navigated challenges and relationships. They had built their entire identity around being successful immigrants whose children validated their decision to leave Mexico, and Sophia's addiction threatened the foundation of that identity. But slowly, as Sophia began treatment and started the long process of recovery, the family began to confront some of the patterns that had contributed to this crisis. Family therapy sessions were difficult and sometimes explosive, as years of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings came to the surface. Their parents had to confront the ways their favoritism had harmed both daughters, and both Rebecca and Sophia had to learn how to express their needs and feelings honestly rather than playing the roles that had been assigned to them. The process wasn't linear or easy, and there were setbacks and conflicts along the way. Recovery from addiction is complex and challenging under the best circumstances, and doing it while also trying to heal family relationships added additional layers of difficulty. But gradually, something new began to emerge from the wreckage of their old family dynamics. Rebecca discovered that setting boundaries didn't mean abandoning her family. It meant engaging with them in ways that were healthy and sustainable. She could love and support Sophia without sacrificing her own well-being, and she could maintain relationships with her parents without accepting treatment that diminished her worth. Most importantly, she learned that her value wasn't determined by her family's recognition of it, and she didn't need their approval to live a meaningful and fulfilling life. Sophia, meanwhile, began the difficult work of building an identity that wasn't dependent on external validation or perfect performance. Treatment helped her understand how the pressure she had felt to be the family's success story had contributed to her anxiety and eventually to her addiction. She also learned to recognize and address the shame that had prevented her from seeking help when she needed it. The family's recovery process also created opportunities for Rebecca's work experience to be valued and appreciated in ways it never had been before. Her understanding of addiction, mental health resources, and family systems became essential tools in navigating Sophia's treatment and the family's healing process. For the first time, her parents began to see Rebecca's career choice not as a disappointment compared to Sophia's legal career, but as valuable expertise that was helping their family survive its greatest crisis. As months turned into years, the Martinez family slowly built new patterns of relating to each other that were based on honesty and mutual support, rather than conditional approval and competition for resources. It wasn't the family Rebecca had always wished for, but it was a family where she could exist authentically without constantly defending her worth or managing others' disappointment in her choices. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, and there were still moments when old patterns surfaced and had to be addressed consciously. Their parents still sometimes slipped into favoritism or expressed disappointment in ways that were hurtful. Sophia still sometimes struggled with perfectionism and the fear of letting people down. Rebecca still sometimes found herself falling into people-pleasing behaviors or doubting her own worth. The crisis that had initially seemed like it would destroy their family ultimately became the catalyst for building more authentic and sustainable relationships. Rebecca learned that she didn't have to choose between loving her family and protecting her own mental health. She could do both by setting appropriate boundaries and refusing to accept treatment that diminished her dignity. Perhaps most importantly, she discovered that her worth had never been determined by her family's recognition of it. The love and respect she deserved had always been available. She just needed to learn to recognize it in the relationships where it was freely given and stop seeking it from sources where it was conditional or unavailable. The story of Rebecca's journey from invisible daughter to empowered woman illustrates one of the most painful but important truths about family relationships. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally are the ones who teach us that love must be earned through performance and achievement. When we grow up in families where approval is scarce and conditional, we often spend decades trying to prove our worthiness to people who have already decided we don't measure up. But healing is possible, even from the deepest family wounds. It requires courage to examine painful patterns honestly, boundaries to protect ourselves from ongoing harm, and the patience to build new ways of relating that honor everyone's inherent worth. It also requires the recognition that we cannot control other people's capacity to love us appropriately, but we can control how much access we give them to our hearts and lives. Rebecca's story reminds us that the child who feels overlooked and undervalued often develops strength, empathy, and resilience that serve them well in adulthood, even if those qualities weren't recognized or appreciated within their family of origin. The pain of feeling invisible in your own family is real and valid, and you deserve relationships that celebrate your worth rather than constantly questioning it. Sometimes that means creating new families of choice with friends and partners who see and value you fully. Sometimes it means setting boundaries with biological family members while working toward healthier dynamics. And sometimes it means recognizing that you cannot change other people, but you can change how much power you give them over your sense of self. Your worth is not determined by other people's recognition of it, even when those people are family members whose approval you desperately want. You are valuable simply because you exist, and you deserve love that doesn't require you to be perfect or to sacrifice parts of yourself to earn it. The journey toward recognizing and claiming that truth can be long and difficult, but it's one of the most important gifts you can give yourself. As we close Rebecca's story, remember that healing isn't a destination but an ongoing process of learning to see yourself clearly. Set boundaries that protect your well-being and invest in relationships that honor your full humanity. You have permission to stop trying to earn love from people who are fundamentally unable to give it freely, and you have the right to build a life surrounded by people who celebrate your existence rather than merely tolerating it. Sometimes the family we're born into teaches us everything about what we don't want in our relationships, and that painful education becomes the foundation for building the kinds of connections we actually deserve. Our story doesn't end with childhood pain or family dysfunction. It begins when you choose to write new chapters based on your own values and vision for what love should look like. If this story has touched something in your heart or reminded you of your own journey toward healing and self-worth, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, you have the power to break cycles of conditional love and create new patterns of authentic connection, both for yourself and for the generations that come after you. Your worth was never in question. You just needed to learn to see it clearly.